in Medtech transactions. My name is Nicole Owens, and I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for Medtech. If you're not familiar with Medtech, we are a medical device trade association for companies in the New England area, and we help bolster the ecosystem through events like this, connection, awareness, and advocacy. Just a quick housekeeping note, we will have some allocated time in the presentation for Q&A. So please go ahead and feel free to type in your questions as our presenters are talking. You can do that either with the Q&A box at the bottom or in the chat function, and I'll be monitoring those to ensure that they're answered. This webinar is also recorded, so everyone who registered will receive the video after the event. So thank you for joining us today. I am now honored to introduce our speakers from Covington. We have Pam Forrest and Andrew Ment. They are both partners at Covington, and they are co-leads of the firm's medical device industry group. So with that, I will turn it over to Pam and Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nicole. So Andrew Ment here. I'm a partner based in New York, and I focus on M&A and other transactions in the medical tech space. So a lot of medical device, some pharmaceuticals, and it's a very interesting area that I've really enjoyed because I get to work closely with people like my partner Pam and learn all about regulation of these devices, which are sort of critical to our society and to patients and providers, as well as learn about other areas like intellectual property and data privacy and other things that become very relevant in these transactions. And given the dynamism of this industry, it's been a great place to build and sustain a career over almost 25 years. So with that, I'll turn over to Pam.
Thanks, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. Nice to be here with you. I'm Pam Forrest. I'm a partner in Covington's FDA practice, and I co-chair our medical device regulatory practice. My practice really involves counseling medical device manufacturers on the full range of FDA requirements, pre-market and post-market, getting onto the market and staying on the market, so to speak. And a large part of what I do is work on M&A transactions that involve FDA-regulated medical device companies, both from the acquirer and the acquiree perspective. So I help acquirers assess the FDA compliance status of potential targets, and I help targets get ready for the scrutiny that comes with being acquired. And as Andrew said, it's been really a marvelous area to work in over, I think 27 years now of working at this intersection of technology, law, and policy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to get us started. And we certainly do look forward to your questions and discussions towards the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Pam. So what we thought we'd do today is we'd sort of talk a little bit about the objectives of the diligence process. And so some thoughts and observations we've had based on what we've seen that's worked well, we think, for clients in this area. And then also talk about some of the key areas of focus. Obviously, regulatory is a critical one. So a substantial portion of our time will be spent on that area of focus. And then, as I said, we'll turn over to questions for discussion. Okay. So the first, and let me just say at the outset, this is largely oriented from a buy-side perspective. So it's think, how will a buyer think about their due diligence process, their goals, their intended outcome, et cetera. But it's actually very relevant to the sell side as well, because when you're on the sell side, you will be confronted with all of the same concerns. From the buy side, they'll be thinking about, well, how does this affect my value proposition? From the sell side, you have to anticipate, how will this affect the buyer's value proposition? How will we best, how do we best understand our business to be able to present it and disclose it to the buyer in a way that will help them get comfortable and will also help us prepare and maybe execute our transaction in the most effective way. And there's obviously going to be some difference in perspective on, when you're in the buyer side, you look at things with some skepticism, and you're really trying to kick tires and validate things. And when you're on the sell side, you're trying to say, well, gee, is this a real problem, or is this something where is this a real problem that I should be trying to solve, or is this a problem where I should be trying to convince the buyer it's not a problem? And so you can have a slightly different take on that. But so let's move on. So, right, you want to identify, is there a huge impediment to continuing the transaction? Are there things you'll need to take into account structuring it? And that could be, the type of transaction you do. That could be particular deal terms you may incorporate. And then, also there's just like, how do you get a deal done? And then what's the best way to have your team work? So determining whether to pursue or not, almost always in any transaction in this space, there are some key assumptions that need to be validated. And sometimes that can be done ahead of time before parties even speak. Sometimes, a buyer, and usually these transactions are initiated by a buyer, although you could imagine a sell side auction, but in terms of the dance, there's really no dance without a buyer. So the buyer will have to have some sense of, do they understand and do they believe that there is a thesis that makes sense from a regulatory perspective? Like, is there a product that's approved? Or if it's a company or a product that's in development, do they have a good sense of comfort that this ultimately will be approved and that there will be a product and a business? And that's kind of thing Pam, and I work very closely on, and sort of that diligence assessment is primary, because if the regulatory assessment comes out that no, you don't think that there is a product, or there will be a product, or that there's a fundamental problem with the product, then there's really not a reason for there to be a transaction in most cases. Similarly on IP, in this space, IP protection is really critical, and understanding whether, if you're looking at a possible transaction, understanding whether there's likely to be exclusivity, very important. Understanding whether there's freedom to operate, also very important. And if there are problems with either of those two, it's very likely that that's going to have an impact on the valuation assumption. So that's another key priority. And then financial diligence, particularly for any kind of on-market product, understanding whether there usually are, the transaction will often be based on some historical level of sales and some projections, and validating that. And I would say if any of these three, a fundamental problem comes up, that likely will be very disruptive to a transaction. But so you want to front load these very much. Then there are sort of a second order that oftentimes I think will get a reviewed in diligence as a sort of a very close, maybe like a 1' priority, and that's understanding what kind of liabilities might associate with a say, let's say you're looking at a possible acquisition of a company, an assessment of what historic liabilities may be at the company, what contingent liabilities there may be. Understanding, going to the regulatory, understanding what is there approved product, is there a possible pending approval, and then are disputes, and those could be commercial disputes, or they could be IP disputes. Those are both pretty common to see. That we see in diligence and transactions, and understanding all of those and how those might inform whether you think they're a deal breaker, and that'll be on the buy side. On the sell side, you might say, how are we going to manage these? And you might conclude, we have an issue with the counterparty, and our product or our business is sort of unmarketable in a transaction unless we get that resolved. And so that might direct a seller to say, we need to get our house in order on this matter before we can really go out and present this as a realistic possibility to a buyer. Because if we order that the other way, where we go out to the buyers first and we see maybe do they care about this dispute being pending or not, it may be much harder for you to resolve. I mean, we see this fairly often, that especially the pretty common fact pattern is a larger more established device company buying kind of smaller companies to add products to a portfolio or a pipeline. And we see very often things that might seem like, one size of problem when they're at the smaller company. When you think about it in the context of, if this much larger company buys them, now it's like an order of magnitude larger problem, or the cost to resolve it becomes much higher because the other side of that dispute starts seeing a lot of dollar signs. So again, from the sell side, these are also very relevant things to understand, because you want to build your overall transaction strategy to accommodate them and achieve your best outcome. So after having done some of that preliminary assessment, we would typically look to understand, do we think that this type of transaction is the best candidate for a stock purchase? Stock purchase usually is the favored approach for a seller. It's usually, though not always, more tax efficient. It's usually an easier execution because you kind of sell when you sell the shares of the company, you sell the box, and all the things that are in the box just go. It leaves the sellers less to deal with afterwards. So from a buyer's perspective, if you can deliver on a proposal for a stock purchase, that'll usually be your most competitive proposal and most attractive from a seller standpoint. And of course, that's what the sellers are going for. But if based on some of that preliminary diligence, buyer identifies that there are issues with significant liabilities, maybe the buyer identifies that there's two businesses, and actually really the transaction is justified by business A, and business B it's not really that interested in. And in the discussion between the buyer and the seller, you realize that they have a different view of the value of business B, and seller isn't willing to just throw in business B, and so you say, well, actually, no, this transaction really ought to be structured as an asset deal. Sometimes you conclude that the nature of the issue, and it may be something like the market the buyer is interested in is limited in some way, maybe territorially, that maybe a license and distribution agreement makes more sense than a pure acquisition. So a lot of things can come out of that initial discussion. And then there's a number of other ways, and so going to the next point is kind of when based on the preliminary assessment, there may be a view of where the key risks are, where the key value drivers are. And from a buyer's perspective, you always want to align your purchase price with value. So it may be that a transaction with 100% of the purchase price being paid up front puts a lot of risk on integration, execution, and future contingencies. And that may not be the right deal structure. And so we see in this space, we see with increasing frequency, and to this point where I would say it's not universal, but maybe in at least half the transactions we work on, we see some element of a contingent payment, which is a way for a buyer to de-risk a transaction, or put another way, for a seller to try to get full value if things pan out the way the sellers hope. So that can often be seen as a win-win area. And so this is something where Pam and I have worked very closely on a number of transactions, because really trying to scope out how the contingent consideration elements of a transaction should work, and work with the actual regulatory pathway for approval that'll validate the kind of hope for value assumptions, ends up being sort of a mixed corporate, transactional, and regulatory question. Then we also inform specific deal terms. A lot of the work can be around looking for identifying where there are required consents or approvals, and those may be governmental consents, they may be third-party consents. If there are particular liabilities, things you want to that the parties want to treat differently or in a specific way. For instance, if there's an historic environmental liability that there needs to be a special deal on, having identified that issue in the diligence process, that'll become part of the deal terms. And closing conditions, so that may be identified. There's a very important supply agreement that has a change of control provision, and so you need to obtain a consent. It can also be things like you've identified that there's that at kind of at some very early stage in a company's development, it negotiated an agreement that, and we see this fairly often with very early stage companies, it's not been drafted or prepared with the level of sophistication that would be warranted when you look at how, say, that company has developed and where their product is, and maybe in the context of what could be a large acquisition transaction. And so, I've had several deals where we've had to go back and say, you need to renegotiate this license or this supply agreement as an element of, so not just a consent, but actually a full-scale renegotiation. It's something contingent on the deal, and you need to be a little bit careful how you stage that when something pre-closing. But we've definitely done that where it's been warranted. And then I'd say, big picture as counsel on transactions in this space, nothing in the world is perfect. And so one of the sort of most important things that we find is when you're counseling clients is to help them assess and understand where something is a deal breaker and where something might be acceptably addressed through contract terms. And that's on both the buy side and the sell side. And I think a lot of the art and a lot of what makes this fun is when the kind of things that, people are sort of, pulling their hair out about and they can't believe this issue. You're like, well, wait, I think we have a way, that there's a path forward, that this still works for everybody. And so when we do that, that feels like a good day's work. Just to touch on some of the other things that we are attending to in the due diligence process, on deals that involve financing, it's very common that the buyer's due diligence will be made available to the financing sources on a non-reliance basis, but essentially to kind of help the financing get a leg up on their own due diligence in order to be able to underwrite the financing. Similarly, on transactions where the buyer is expected to obtain a representation and warranty insurance policy, the sort of the scope of diligence needs to align with the rep and warranty insurer's needs, because what they will do is they will in deciding whether they can provide coverage for all of the warranties in the agreement, they will look to see what level of work and inquiry has the buyer made to understand, whether there's any issues in the warranties. And what we've seen is from time to time, if it may be a very acceptable outcome for a buyer to say, I don't think it justifies cost benefit for me to look into this particular area. I'm going to get decent warranties in the purchase agreement. I'll rely on reps and warranties. That in the non-rep and warranty insurance world, that's like a very reasonable way to go for certain things. In the rep and warranty insurance world, the underwriter will typically say, well, if you haven't diligenced this, we're not underwriting it, which will mean that there's no coverage for that rep and warranty. And depending on how the transaction agreement is agreed, but a fairly customary approach would be that there is no seller indemnification for the reps and warranties, or just a very, very minimal, 0.5% exposure. And so if as a buyer, you sort of are in that position where you have a rep and warranty policy, but you don't diligence something, you may end up effectively with no remedy there. So that's just an important consideration as you're scoping out your diligence, if you will have that. And the last thing is preparing for post-closing integration. So there are lots of things identified in due diligence that don't ever touch, the contract. The findings are never reflected one way or another, but they're very important for a buyer to know and understand for when they're going to come to own the business. Just a note on organizing the diligence team. So, the overall goal is for findings and issues to be collected and considered holistically in the context of the overall business objective. And that's probably maybe obvious, but executing on that can be challenging because, like, just even going back to that first slide where I described, you've got a regulatory inquiry, an IP inquiry, a finance inquiry, you have review of contracts. People can get very siloed, but it's really, in order to be effective on either the buy side or the sell side is all these things need to kind of feed into and a sort of a comprehensive assessment of sort of what needs to be done, what needs to be addressed, what are issues, how do we assess things. And so what we often see is that it'll fall to somebody like me or someone on my team to be kind of a clearinghouse to incorporate and take input from various functional areas and make sure things are linked up. And so to give an example, if there's a data room and there are 10 supply agreements, it might be, and maybe as part of the buyer's integration plan, they kind of know they're going to, transition away from 3 of them, but that there are 2 that are really important. I mean, that's the kind of thing that on the corporate side, we need to know. On the regulatory side, Pam needs to know to say, well, which suppliers are the really critical ones for us to make sure that we think they are, robust and compliant and they'll meet everything. On the corporate side, those are the agreements that I need to be most focused on to make sure I understand, questions about the term and whether that's kind of a solid and reliable long-term source of supply. And, we sort of need a business person to tell both of us what's important. And so that's got to be kind of a conversation that goes on so that we're all reporting in and working collaboratively. As I sort of said, there's some things that are go, no go, ideally in a diligence process, it's in everybody's interest that if there are no-go items that they're identified as early as possible, because then you can sort of save people the time and the aggravation of having gone down a road and something falling apart. But you sort of, you don't necessarily know where the no-go item will be until you start reviewing. So, but it's important, I think, to have kind of real-time feeding back. It's very common in these processes to do something like have, say, a weekly check-in, like every Thursday, the teams will check in. But you also want to have the real-time input. So if somebody finds something on a Monday, that can be kind of surfaced up to people to be considered by the deal leadership right away. And then a note on competitively sensitive information, and this is both on the buy side and the sell side. There's some things where the competitive customer information like pricing, where from an antitrust perspective, there's some real we've got some tension between allowing a buyer to see what they really need to understand about a target, but also not finding yourself in a place where you're colluding and sharing pricing that may be anti-competitive in effect. So that's often maybe handled on an outside counsel basis, where then outside counsel can share on a de-identified basis to say, okay, we've found that average pricing is around this area, or there's some high, here's a high, here's a low. Exactly how you can handle that in a way that you can mitigate any anti-competitive impact while still giving the buyer the information that they need to understand what's going on. And so that's kind of like the law has some constraints on what you might share, but a seller may also feel very strongly they don't, there's no deal until a deal is signed, and they may feel very strongly they don't want to share certain information directly with their competitor pre-signing. And so both of those could lead to down that path. Similarly with technical R&D information, pretty common that sellers targets will be very anxious about the idea of sharing all of their highly confidential and competitively sensitive information with a potential competitor. And so they may insist on implementing a clean team. And we see that fairly commonly, that there'll be a team that's meant to be kind of limited, not involved in those activities on a kind of regular basis on behalf of the buyer, who will look at things and then kind of report back in a sort of desensitized way to the deal team in order for them to be able to make a decision. On the buy side, you have to think about, do you have the right people in order to put together a clean team that can effectively assess something without including your team that actually works in that area. So that's often a consideration you have to work through. There is some benefit on the buy side of the clean team, because if a deal falls through, every confidentiality agreement will have a restriction on using the information that's been reviewed in the course of due diligence for any purpose other than evaluation. And it's sort of hard for people to unlearn things. And so you kind of are sort of vulnerable if your head of R&D has just reviewed a potential competitor's competitively sensitive information, no deal occurs, and then the purported or potential buyer, who ends up not being a buyer, goes ahead and does a whole lot of R&D and develops something in that space. It's sort of hard to prove, how did you not make use of the information provided in due diligence? So the clean team can be a good factual, assistance from the factual standpoint of establishing. Okay, so that's kind of the preliminaries on big picture ideas of diligence. Now we'll turn over to Pam to lead on the regulatory areas, and then I'll come back on some corporate areas.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.
Please move to the next slide. So in terms of regulatory and just diligence in general, when we're talking about transactions, acquisitions, mergers involving medical device companies, I think really the most important regulatory areas of focus are FDA, kind of general healthcare compliance, which of course goes to the company's interactions with healthcare professionals, anti-kickback considerations, fraud and abuse considerations, and then of course reimbursement, because as we know, even if you have an approved or cleared product, if a HCP can't get paid for it or a hospital can't get paid for it, then it's there's not a lot of value there. So I think it's that constellation of issues that deserves the most kind of critical focus in a medical device diligence. My area of expertise is FDA, so that's what we'll talk about this morning. But I certainly, want to give sort of due notice to the other areas which deserve a lot of scrutiny in a diligence. So let's talk FDA, and we can move to the next slide, and even probably the next slide. And just by way of background, I think from an FDA diligence perspective, the world kind of breaks down into sort of two lenses. One where the target is pre-commercial, and meaning no commercialized product on the market, and the other is where there is commercialized product. So I think if you want to back up one slide, Andrew, yeah. So let's first talk a little bit about targets that are pre-commercial. And again, as Andrew said, the way our deck is written, it's written from the perspective of an acquirer looking to evaluate a target. But these issues ring very true for a target who is preparing to be diligenced by a potential acquirer or acquirers. So these are really areas that a target needs to sort of do self-diligence on to make sure that they're ready to answer the hard questions. And of course, the overarching issue for pre-commercialized targets is what is the prospect that they'll actually be able to commercialize their product? And we take a good hard look in a very granular fashion at a number of things, with a big focus on the correspondence between the target and FDA regarding the current and the planned development pathway. So clinical and non-clinical studies, pending pre-market review submissions. And I've listed here just some examples of what we would look at closely in an effort to detect the subtle nuances that may swing an FDA decision one way or another in terms of a 510K, a PMA, or a de novo. The IDE correspondence, the pre-market review submissions, and the process that ensues, the back and forth on a 510K or a PMA. What questions are FDA reviewers asking? Are they raising significant questions about product design or flagging potential safety issues? I always look carefully at meetings of minutes and calls between FDA and the target regarding IDE applications and pre-market review submissions. On the IDE side, for example, If the study was it approved with a host of design considerations, study design considerations, where FDA is saying, we'll approve the study, but FYI, these are issues that might present a problem in terms of our actually approving a 510K or approving a PMA or clearing a 510K. So again, in diligence, it's sort of all about what's the message that's being conveyed from the regulatory agency about their comfort level with the pipeline product. And Andrew, we can move to the next slide. And then, another area in the pre-commercial world is just sort of the core regulatory compliance. Is the target in compliance with the full set of clinical trial requirements? For example, if there is a study underway, was the appropriate determination made as to whether it was a significant or non-significant risk rationale? And then, of course, if there's some questions about whether the NSR determination was correct, what does that imply? Should there have been an IDE application filed? Are questions being raised about the clinical trial? Has there been a clinical hold? What were the results of the BIMO inspection? Do the informed consent forms contain all the content that FDA would expect? Has the study been registered on clinicaltrials.gov? So really a kind of a checklist of core kind of pre-commercial compliance points that we look at. And then if we're working with the target, we help the target to kind of vet its own correspondence and compliance and be prepared to answer the tough questions. We can move to the next slide, Andrew. So again, sort of pulling up in terms of the key considerations pre-commercial, is the target following the guidance and agreements reached with FDA regarding the development of the product? If not, is there a solid rationale as to why not? Are there other areas of non-compliance that pose risk to successful commercialization? Can areas of non-compliance be addressed post-close? I think the next one is really important. What is the target's plan, if any, for commercialization? I mean, of course, just getting the product on the market is one thing, but how will it be manufactured and distributed? Is in-house manufacturing contemplated or contract manufacturing? What is the distribution pathway? And then a really critical kind of regulatory risk assessment around how the target has been positioning the investigational device. Do we see outright or implied promotion of the investigational device, which of course can trigger FDA enforcement scrutiny? Okay, let's move now to the set of considerations that we look at in connection with a target that has commercialized product. And I think, here the question that resonates throughout the slides is basically, if the transaction goes through, can the acquirer on day one sort of operate the business at its full potential? And that's what the acquirer is always looking for. And that's the main question the target's going to have to answer at both a high level and granular way. So the first area that goes to that is, of course, marketing authorization. And the foundational question as to whether the target has a supportable regulatory basis for every device it markets. And what we encourage clients to do who are looking to acquire a target is to request a list of all the products that the target has on the market. And then associated with that, what are the approvals and the clearances that go with each device? And if there isn't an approval or clearance, what's the basis for operating on the market without an approval or clearance? What is the rationale for the product being exempt? So for companies that are looking to be acquired, I think it's a really useful exercise to, in anticipation of the diligence process, to put together that chart and to pressure test it. Are there devices that we're considering to be 510K exempt where we've always been a little bit concerned that we may not have a solid basis, that we may be beyond the limits of the exemption in terms of intended use or fundamental scientific technology? Those are going to be the areas that the lawyers on the other side are asking questions about, because I certainly have asked those questions a number of times. Related to that question about whether there's a supportable regulatory basis for marketing every device is, whether where there is a clearance or approval in place, has the device been modified in a way that goes beyond the limits of the clearance. That's an area of significant FDA enforcement and scrutiny. And we in the diligence process will look really carefully at no 510K rationales. You know, how did the target decide that it could make that modification without seeking a new clearance? Okay, let's move to the next slide. So, you know, as you'll see in the slides that follow, we really tick through the list of general controls in FDA's regulations and kind of check out where the target stands with regard to each of those. So, you know, after that basic look at the marketing authorization piece, then we move to establishment, registration, device listing. The key question for us there is, are all the facilities within the target appropriately registered, and are all the devices listed? And so just like on the marketing authorization side, we will encourage our clients to ask the target for a list of all of the facilities that it has and describe the activities that are occurring there. What are we looking for in that inquiry? We're looking to see whether there's a facility that's performing manufacturing that isn't registered. And you know, often, you know, one of the pitfalls we see is a target who has mistakenly sort of categorized a facility as a pure distribution facility, when in fact there is kind of a subtle manufacturing activity going on there, like perhaps device kitting, which has been missed. And so, you know, if that's the case, then, you know, we look to see whether that facility has a QSR, a quality system regulation compliant operation set up. So there's a kind of a cascade of issues that can flow if there are problems with the registration and listing analysis. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Labeling and promotion is a big deal. And you know, the seminal question there is always whether the target is engaging in what could be viewed as off-label or otherwise impermissible promotion. And that is really very closely linked to kind of the value of the deal. Because if, you know, a large share of the revenues of the target are associated with off-label promotion, that can really put the company in jeopardy going forward and will be looked at very carefully by the acquirer. So, you know, what we often do on behalf of our clients who are looking to acquire a target is we put together our own chart. We put in one column the cleared indications for use for a product, and another column the claims that are being made. And we look very carefully with a fine-tooth comb to see where there are departures from those cleared indications for use. And we have hard discussions with the target about why they feel those claims are justified. We'll look at the website claims. We'll look carefully at social media. We'll look at the sales training materials to see how the sales reps are sort of talking about the product in the field. And we'll look carefully at the procedures that the target has developed to govern its own labeling and promotion development. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So the importance of having a sort of a compliant quality system, I think, can't be overemphasized for a target that's preparing for a diligence process. And it's one of the key areas of risk that a potential acquirer will look at. What we're looking at is to see whether there are gaps in the GMP compliance status of the target, because that can, of course, create FDA enforcement exposure, and it can also increase the target's product liability risk. If there are quality issues with the products coming out of the target, again, that's not just an FDA issue, but it also is potentially a product liability issue. We find that the best way to really assess the quality system compliance status is to do an on-site audit. Sometimes that's not possible. As Andrew teed up, there can be some real sensitivity from a target's perspective about letting an acquirer or a potential acquirer come in and sort of look at their manufacturing operation. So if we don't have access through an on-site audit, there a lot can be learned from a document review. And we look at inspectional history, and I think if you move to the next slide, we talk a little bit more about kind of what we're really looking at when we diligence the quality system issues. As I mentioned, inspectional history, 483s, establishment inspection reports. If third parties have conducted audits of the target, we'll look at those. I think it's very important to look at a sample of complaints that the target has received, and understand if there are repetitive complaints that the target is receiving. Are they opening CAPAs to address those? Are the CAPAs being closed efficiently and effectively, or are they languishing? And then maybe one of the most important areas is whether the target is appropriately submitting MDR reports and sort of related adverse event reports to the OUS authorities. It's interesting. I often tell clients who are looking to acquire a target that if a target sort of boasts about the fact that it's never submitted an MDR report, to me, that's a real red flag. In the same way, if a target has never conducted a recall, and it may be counterintuitive because, of course, the absence of MDR reports and the absence of recalls can potentially be a sense of a highly functioning quality system. But in my experience, it's actually more often the other way, which is it means that the target may not be appropriately evaluating complaints for MDR reportability, or may not be appropriately identifying systemic quality issues and not taking those recalls when they should be taken. So I think that's an area where a target really needs to do a lot of sort of self-introspection. And it's an area where an acquirer will be on the real lookout for potential problems. And we can move to the next slide. Another important area, and Andrew got to this a little bit, is kind of supply chain. And if there's the opportunity, we encourage clients who are potential acquirers to also diligence those high stakes suppliers. We often go in and conduct an on-site audit of the critical contract manufacturers. We review the inspectional history because we often now see companies who are sourcing overseas, perhaps a manufacturing facility in China. And FDA looks with great scrutiny at those overseas manufacturing facilities. And to the extent FDA finds problems, FDA will not hesitate to impose an import detention on those products coming from the overseas contract manufacturers, and talk about a bottleneck in the supply chain if you can't get your product back in to the US. So that's a real watch out for diligence of a target. How solid is that supply chain? We can move to the next slide. I think we've talked about recalls. We look for recalls that should have been taken and weren't. And we also look for recalls that were taken but weren't appropriately reported to FDA. And then a third inquiry we often make is to whether there are what FDA thinks of as silent recalls. Did the target take an action such as disseminating a technical advisory, which advises customers to work around with a certain device to avoid a potential malfunction. Those can be viewed by FDA as recalls, and it's a heavy area of FDA enforcement in the same way that MDR reporting is. So again, kind of a constellation of issues that we look at around recalls. And we can go to the next slide, Andrew. Clinical studies, I think we kind of covered that in the pre-commercial area, but I guess one other thing just to note is even if a company is fully commercialized, they still may be conducting post-market clinical studies of their devices, and there's some important areas of diligence around those. Has IRB approval been appropriately sought? Has informed consent been appropriately sought? Are investigator-initiated studies being handled appropriately? Then I think just one more slide, if we can move to that last one, Andrew. And this is, I think, kind of goes without saying, is sort of, to what extent has the target been the target of government enforcement activity? Have there been warning letters? Have there been untitled letters? Have there been it's come to our attention letters? We're kind of living in an era now with medical device enforcement where we see fewer and fewer warning letters, but we see a lot of what are called it's come to our attention letters, which are not public, but sort of have the same message from FDA, where FDA is questioning the practices of the company in terms of their FDA compliance status. And then sort of, ramping it up, has there been correspondence regarding FDA's application integrity policy? So are there sort of data integrity issues, subpoenas, consent decrees, import detentions, corporate integrity agreements? Of course, all of these will raise the antennas of the potential acquirer and the acquirer's counsel. So with that intro, I'll turn it back to you. I know we're running a little short on time.
Great, thanks, Pam. So we thought we'd do to sort of wind up our presentation portion of today's session is talk about a few areas where on the corporate side, we tend to be sort of more involved, although as I said in the outset, we sort of tend to serve as a clearinghouse for everything. So the first, on intellectual property agreements, I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with someone who will say, "Oh, we have a license," as if they think that's the end of the question as to what rights do they have to something. And I'm sure most of the people on this call are going to be very aware, but you have to actually say, license doesn't answer the question. You have to say what are the scope of rights granted, and then in particular where a license may, there may be different scopes depending on particular portfolios of IP. You need to make sure you understand that you've got the scope you expect or need for the relevant IP. And so this is an area we'll work closely with the IP, the real, substantive IP diligence team who are reviewing patents and prosecution, but to understand, are the key patents owned or they in-licensed? Do we think that there are any out licenses? And then we'll review those agreements, and we'll be, very focused on understanding and confirming that we think, let's say, if you're on the buy side, that the company has adequate rights and access to the IP that covers or is practiced by the products that are in question in the transaction. That's like a fundamental thing that we do. We'll consider whether there are competing claims. I think there's going to be another session for this group a little bit later, maybe this summer in the fall, about sort of what I call the two hats problem. I mean, we see this a lot where there are, say, professors at a university who, invent something and then they start up a little company to develop it and see if they can commercialize it. And there's some question that needs to be assessed as to whether there might be claims to that invention from their university. And so digging into that is something where we'll, there'll be the policy that needs interpretation. There'll be the facts of, where's the work been done. And so that'll be kind of a mixed, I would say, like corporate lawyer and real IP lawyer question. Obviously, for any license, understanding exclusivity, field, territory limitations, feeding that into a business team to think about whether a field split or a territory split presents issues. For instance, I'm going to Pam's thing where products that have significant off-label use. I mean, sometimes if you have a limit to your field, that's going to limit for how you can promote. But it may be that somebody else may have an approval for a different field, and that could seriously erode your market potential. So understanding that's important. And then we always check. We see a lot of the time that there's an inadequate sublicensing right. Like there may be that there's a restriction on sublicensing. There may be that it just says has a right to sublicense and raises some question as to whether that's an initial sublicense, but doesn't necessarily permit multiple tiers, particularly where we think that a large integrated company may be acquiring a product and may want to have different entities within its overall organization exploiting technology. We're pretty focused on the sublicensing. And then, we always look to see what kinds of, we call them the diligence obligations. What are the commitments associated with a license agreement? In particular, are there, deadlines by which perhaps the licensors are as a termination right, or some, you see sometimes a right to terminate, or maybe a right to convert an exclusive license to non-exclusive. And those are very important things to understand, and they may feed into some of the things I spoke about at the outset. You may need to say, well, look, what the company has got a plan, and they're definitely not going to hit the deadline in a license. So this needs to be amended in order for a deal to move forward. And so identifying that kind of thing. Royalty payments, making sure that royalties and milestones are understood, and if applicable, incorporated in a financial model is very important. Then there's the sort of standard.
Andrew,
Every agreement we look for term. Are there any non-standard termination rights, restriction on assignment? That may feed back into our thinking about how to structure a transaction. If we see that there's, a key contract, it could be a license. The same thing will come up in supply agreements in a minute, where there's a restriction on an assignment, but there's not a restriction on a change of control. That's going to steer us more to a stock sale.
Andrew, can I jump in for a sec?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to pause for a minute, because I know we only have about 7 minutes left, and I wondered if we should just check with Nicole and see if there are questions, so we can be sure to answer those, and then we can return back to the slides. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Nicole, do you want to jump in and let us know if there aren't questions? We'll just continue, but we don't want to give short shrift.
Sure. We actually do have one question, so I'll go ahead and read it here.
Sure.
If the buyer and seller are both LLCs and the buyer does not want the tax burdens associated with a stock sale, is there an option similar to the section 338G or 10H election that can be instituted?
Okay, so I'm going to preface everything I say by saying I'm not a tax lawyer. But I think I sort of know where you're going with this. I think, yes, there is probably an option. I mean, depending on how the LLC has elected to be treated for tax purposes, that's going to be an important consideration. But if it's been elected to be treated as a pass-through, then I think in most cases, but this is going to have to be confirmed in any particular case, in most cases, a purchase of the assets will not be taxable at the LLC level. It'll be passed through. And so it'll be treated sort of like a 338 election if it was a corporate seller. And that means that the members of the LLC will recognize gain in the transaction as if they had sold the assets based on their allocable share of the LLC's profits. So that's kind of like quick and dirty. So I think the answer is like, yes, you do have a path forward to sort of get the asset sale benefits of a step up, maybe leaving some things behind. You still have the kind of what I would call the overall kind of corporate lawyer issues that the owner of an LLC may really want to basically kind of tie a bow around the LLC and give that to the buyer and say, now I'm done. And they may not be super thrilled at the idea of being left with, say, certain historic liabilities, certain historic assets that maybe aren't really viable on their own. So you might have a path forward.
Okay, great. We have another question as well. Have you experienced desire from your clients to perform any sort of technology evaluation in due diligence process, e.g. running a validation study or benchtop performance testing?
Yeah, I think that's, definitely something that's interesting. It implicates a lot of the considerations both Pam and I touched on about, competitively sensitive information, maybe not wanting to share all of that. But yeah, we definitely see things like that in the due diligence. They're not really kind of core corporate lawyer diligence. I don't know, Pam, if you've had experience sort of helping advise on those issues.
I haven't really, although I assume that's going on to the extent it can be going on given the sensitivities. I mean, just sort of the potential acquirer, wanting to get better sense of the efficacy of the product and the competitive viability of it. But it wouldn't say, it doesn't really directly implicate or involve my work, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the way this sort of thing would appear to me is that we would sort of know that it might be on the Gantt chart as a step that needs to happen before we could be in a position to make a go no go decision. I would say it's in M&A deals, it's less likely to be something that's handled within the contract. You do see in other types of transactions. I mean, I've worked on things that are sort of quasi acquisitions, have some licensing, some collaboration elements where there may be stages of development and, kind of product validation for a product that's being co-developed, could be a critical stage to go to the next stage, maybe a triggering for a co-development or an acquisition or something. So you do see those elements.
And I think we have a follow-on to that question. So
no.
Could the sensitivity be alleviated through the use of a third party?
Yes, I think so. Again, I mean, to me, it seems that would be a path you could go down. I think it all would depend from the buyer's standpoint whether, it's possible to instruct an independent third party on, what would constitute a thumbs up and what would constitute a thumbs down in a way that, you don't think sort of makes that thumbs up, thumbs down kind of give too much information if you're the target or the seller, but gives enough if you're the buyer that you can rely on it and move forward. But I think that would be fairly common. I know that
I would say it's kind of an analogous situation that we have been involved in where there's a desire for an on-site audit of the target's facility, but the target doesn't want the potential acquirer to send their people in because of the competitive sensitivities. And so there's an agreement that a third party will come in and do the audit. It's actually, we as a firm do that because we have auditors on our team. And that so comfort can be achieved on all sides by a third party involvement, but there is the tricky issue then of, as Andrew said, both in the inspectional sense, the testing sense, what is going to be good enough and how do you communicate that without, again, stepping in the middle of the sensitivities. But we have seen sort of the third party route work on the audit front.
Great. We have one more question here. What's your guidance on how to value IP, for example, patents?
Wow. So I don't really have any guidance. I sort of have some observations of what I've seen people do. I mean, there's, at the end of the day, I think a patent isn't really valuable on its own unless it covers a product. So I think really people are, you have to say, well, okay, what do we think is covered by that patent? And then, we sort of modeling what's the market opportunity of the relevant product. And patents can be of all different types, right? I mean, it could be, exactly on the construction of a device. It could be on the use of a device for a particular purpose. It could be on a particular way of making a device. And so, the level to which you can engineer around a patent is going to have a huge driver on value, even once you determine what you think the relevant product's value is. So I think it's kind of like a very big, complicated question and hard to respond generically. But that's what I would say is start out looking at the product opportunity and then figure out how much exclusivity do you think is really afforded by the patent.
Those are all the questions we have right now.
I think we're at time, so we may need to conclude.
We are. Are there any last remarks you guys want to close up your slides with?
I think I would just say that, in a couple of minutes I've had reflecting on what we've talked about already. I think the remaining points were really going to be sort of the more detailed instances of things that we kind of talked about overall, about, looking at the robustness of contract rights, looking, making sure you sort of dig into them and how they align with the deal expectations, both on the sell side and buy side. So, I don't think that we've missed anything substantial.
I think that's right. And I would just say that, to the extent that there are questions, because this is a topic Andrew and I could spend a half day or longer talking about, and our experience is deep, and we would be delighted to chat, if anyone has any follow-up questions. I mean, please don't hesitate to email us and we'll just jump on a call, and happy to chat more granularly if that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. As you can tell that we could go for a long time on this.
A lot of interest here, you guys. So we definitely appreciate you taking the time. Andrew, would you mind flipping back to the intro slide that has your guys' emails on it in case anyone wants to reach out to you with a question?
And there now.
Wonderful. And I would again just like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you to our sponsor Covington, and thank you to Pam and Andrew for taking the time out of their certainly busy schedules to join us with this valuable information. I invite you all to visit massmedic.com and look at our upcoming events. We do these webinars very frequently, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.